Today on the podcast, we're joined by education leader Reid Saaris. He's the founder of Equal Opportunity Schools, a nonprofit dedicated to ensuring that students of all backgrounds have opportunities to succeed at the highest levels. He is an Echoing Green, a Draper Richards Kaplan, and a Stanford Social Innovation Fellow, and has advised federal, state, and local leaders, teachers, companies, and universities on topics like justice, impact, data analysis, communications, and learning. His most challenging and meaningful professional experiences have been as a classroom teacher. He is also author of the new book, The Kid Across the Hall. Today, we'll be talking about why what is often called the achievement gap in schools is actually an opportunity gap, and what teachers can do about it starting right away. Hey there, I'm your host, Betsy Potash, and one-pagers, project-based learning, and choice reading are my jam. I believe in you, and my goal is to help you explore all the creative possibilities you dream of for your classroom. I'm an educator, a chocolate cake aficionado, a traveler who can't wait to get back to Barcelona, and the kind of mom who brings her own mini makerspace to her kid's classroom when she comes to volunteer. I know this for sure, creativity isn't always easy. As a creative teacher, you get parent calls you treasure, and plenty of sidelong comments you'd rather forget. But here's the bottom line. Creative education can ignite a spark in your students and change their lives forever. You and I know this. You're an innovator, and while it's sometimes hard, it's so worth it. So let's explore the world of creative education together. Welcome to the Spark Creativity Teacher Podcast. Well, welcome to the show, Reid. It's so wonderful to have you here.
Oh, thanks for having me.
I wanted to start with your personal story, the story of how you came into this work. So please tell us how it all began with the kid across the hall.
Oh, yes, absolutely. So, there were two kids across the hall in my early life. One was my foster sister. She came to live with us when I was 9 years old and in my only childhood home, and she was six, and we were her 10th home at that point. And so I got to start to see and understand different types of lives and how different folks were treated by our educational system. And so there was a lot of things said about what she could and couldn't do because of the types of things she'd been through. And I knew Erin well and knew that she could do incredible things. And so started to become suspicious of some of these ways that our systems sort people based on some idea or preconceived notion of what the kid could or couldn't do. And so she was just across the hallway in our house from me. And then the next kid across the hall was my best friend. And we grew up and did everything together until this point in high school when kids are assigned to classes that will get them ready for college or something else. And my mom was a career school counselor and knew the system and pointed me in the direction of college level courses and experiences. And Jamie was among the first in his family to go through those sorts of experiences and didn't get the same sort of support and opportunity. So he was educated just across the hall while I was doing exciting essays and debates and discussions, and he was coloring in worksheets and maps and things like that, even as a 16, 17-year-old student.
Wow. So these things that happened in your adolescence and in your childhood led you into the work that you're in now. How would you summarize that work if you were just going to give it like 30 seconds?
Sure. I've spent my career fighting for opportunity for kids and make sure that I think our schools can do incredible things. And how do we make sure that kids of every background get access to that? So I've done that as a teacher, a nonprofit executive, partnering with schools all across the country, and now as an advocate and a candidate for state superintendent.
Wonderful. Well, I've been listening to you this week on other podcasts on YouTube, and I've been so interested in your work. And one thing I have heard you say over and over is that we shouldn't be calling the gap between different student scores an achievement gap. We should be calling it an opportunity gap. And when I hear you share the statistics and the stories that you share, that seems like as clear as day to me. It's not an achievement gap, it's an opportunity gap. So can you tell us about that?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, I think it was during some time I spent at Education Trust getting incubated. I first came across this idea, and yeah, if you take a student like my best friend at the time, and you see a different set of circumstances that he was coming from, and my mom knowing how to navigate the system, while he didn't have that sort of support of somebody who was an insider who knew how to navigate the system. In knowing Jamie, simply knew that he was, eminently capable of doing great things in school and great ideas. We'd have great debates while we were, delivering papers on our newspaper route and things like this. And so, if you go in and you look at achievement test scores, you're going to find probably, I don't know what his achievement test scores actually were, honestly, but you probably are going to find differences if I'm spending my day really reading deep texts and being asked to write essays and doing calculus and these sorts of things, and he's being asked to color in a worksheet. That's going to start to show up on an achievement test score. Same with all the things we talk about kids' access to numbers of words and reading support and all of those sorts of things. And so, to me, it goes back to knowing people and having this deep, deep, deep belief that people's abilities don't vary based on race, based on gender, based on socioeconomic class. Everyone has a fundamental deep appetite to learn, a hunger for knowledge and understanding and engaging tough issues and questions and all of those sorts of things. And so that means that achievement test results and what we have called the achievement gap is really the result of differing opportunities that folks have been given to learn more than anything else. And focusing on the achievement gap, I think, often gets us thinking about low income students and students of color as low achievers, when really what we should be thinking about is what are the different opportunities that we're giving to different students, and how is that showing up in the teachers that kids have access to, the curriculum that they have access to, the money that is in their schools, and how that differs based on race and income and all those sorts of things. So I think opportunity gap is a constructive way to look at what we as educators can address
Yeah.
to dismantle the achievement gap.
You have shared the story of a school where you worked. Is it in South Carolina? North Carolina?
Yes, South Carolina.
South Carolina, where your students just went through this big transformation in opportunity. They I'm trying to reconstruct in my mind. You added many AP class offerings, right? Or you brought many more students into your AP class offerings. And then what happened? Tell us about that experience.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. So it started out with a student who reminded me of my best friend, and
Mhm.
I was frustrated that I hadn't been able to change opportunities for Jamie, but with the student that I had, now I was in a position where he was bored by his classes. He wanted to take on more challenge. He was debating interesting ideas and doing all this cool stuff. And I thought, well, let's change his schedule and move him up to. We had some AP, we had IB. Ended up moving him up to a full diploma for the IB program. And I remember that moment of my own self doubt from the counselor is saying, "Well, geez, he's got a 1.7 GPA." And that ironically was the exact same GPA that Jamie, my best friend, had had.
Mm.
And I was thinking I could use that number against the student as a reason not to give him opportunities. But if I'm really focused on closing the opportunity gap, I'm not going to get too concerned with the GPA. I'm going to say, I think when given great opportunities, the student can do great work. And that's what turned out to happen. Not only did he describe it as a life changing opportunity that not many students get. But the other students in the class, myself, we learned a tremendous amount as well by having him in the class, and it made it a richer and better class. And so when I was promoted to be the coordinator over the IB and AP programs the following year, I said, we're missing students. We're missing students who are capable of doing this work. And it's not through ill intent, it's the way that our systems have been designed. But let's go out and find them. Let's go out and have conversations with every 10th grader who's going to be making a decision for next year as to what types of classes they're going to get involved with. Let's meet with their parents. and we did that work. And I think, it was amazing to have those experiences. And I write about them in the book. And it's one of the sections that going back on or other people reading is I think, especially moving section of the book, to all these meetings with students where it's really this experience of getting beyond, a test score or a grade on a transcript and saying, who are you? What are you interested in? What are you up to? Are you being challenged by your classes? Later on, we would find the data that 86% of Black and Latino students not in AP and IB classes say that they're not challenged by their classwork. And so 86% of kids outside of those advanced programs not being challenged is what I started to find at the individual student level in the school, just having conversations with kids and meeting with them and sitting down. And they would say, yeah, I would work harder if I had more, challenging ideas. If we were discussing some interesting things, that would be great. Yeah, I'd be willing to step up and do that sort of work. And it was a moment that was transformative for them, but it was transformative for me as an educator too, because I got to go beyond my preconceived notions of what kids could do and just hear the stories from them. And nonetheless, I would say when we doubled the size of the advanced programs in a year, tripled the participation of African American students in AP and IB classes, the notion that they couldn't do the work, or the fear that they couldn't do the work, was still inside of me, and my brain and my mind was worried,
Mhm.
as I think a lot of us are when we make those big changes. But closing those longstanding gaps and really closing an opportunity gap for kids ended up, you speak of sparking creativity. It sparked the creativity in those students. It sparked the creativity in teachers, and it opened something up that had never been there before. And so instead of the scores and the success of the program going down, as many folks fear, the pass rate on the AP and IB tests went up by 20% when we had closed these access gaps. And so that to me was a moment of a celebration and excitement, but it was also a call to action that if it's true that we had been missing so many students, who were just across the hall from the education they needed and deserved, then there was a real call to action. How do we find all those students? And so that motivated me to start a national nonprofit to help people across the country do that work.
It's such an inspiring story. Like the case study is so dramatic, and it just feels like something that can be replicated in every school. Like, why wouldn't we replicate that in every
Yes.
school? It's
Yes.
fantastic. I wanted to zero in a little bit on that process when you were meeting with the families, when you were meeting with the students. I was really fascinated by this graph I saw in one of your presentations that showed how much students knew about AP classes, IB classes, how much they knew about what happens in those classes, how much they knew about the benefits of those classes. And I mean, I just thought about my own life and how baked in that knowledge was for me with my dad being a
Yeah.
college professor, you know,
Yep.
and the history of my family. And it was just like, oh yeah, well, of course I'm going to take those AP classes. Um, Talk to us a little bit about just the understanding of the programs and how teachers can make sure that students are aware of those offerings, of the inherent benefits of those offerings.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it really goes back to your other good question about the opportunity gap. If you look at, and it's often the case, it varies depending on the school, but the national data, and we've looked at this data for every high school in the United States, it's often the case that Black and Latino students may be participating in AP and IB at half the rate of other students in the school. And you may find a third of the rate for low income students, these sorts of patterns. And so if you look at that, you could say, well, you know, those kids don't have what it takes. Those kids aren't motivated. You could tell all these stories about why that would be. But if you take the opportunity gap perspective on it, you say, well, do they have the same opportunity to sign up as other kids? Let's take a look at that, and let's sort of interrogate that idea from an opportunity perspective that says, hey, kids of every background would love to tackle interesting questions and think about literature and do critical analysis and be creative, in their classes, and take that to a higher level. We're all born to learn. So what was behind that? So that's when, both in my individual meetings with kids, in South Carolina, and then increasingly across the country with the nonprofit Equal Opportunity Schools, we would survey every student and we would survey every staff member, and we would start to build the picture of exactly where did these gaps come from. And to your point about those charts, you could see radical differences in the ways in which low income students, Black students, Latino students, Native students, and others had the basic information. What is an AP class? Are there benefits to taking an IB class? How do I sign up? Am I welcome to sign up? Are there things I would need to do or go through? And the understanding of those things, to your point, from a family and education. My family is in education as well. I'm a fourth generation educator. Those were baked in to what we knew. And so we started to be able to develop the picture and say, hey, not only do students have very different basic information about what these opportunities are, they also have different levels of encouragement from adults to participate. And so I may have been encouraged by my parents to participate, while other parents like Jamie's may not know that the program exists. And so we looked even at that, and we saw in many cases somebody who's encouraged at least once by an adult to participate is 4 times as likely to sign up.
Wow.
So how could we then, as teachers, get that information and say, hey, I could have a conversation with a kid that's going to change their opportunity set fundamentally and start to align with the fact that they want to go to college. And we know that they want to go to college, but they just have never had anybody have that conversation with them about the opportunity and what does it take and what does it mean when you're going into 11th grade, the types of things you should be studying. And is that a place where I belong? I don't see a lot of kids who look like me there. Oh, but this teacher has come to me and said they think I can do it. Great. I'll step up and take on the challenge.
That's so lovely. I feel like so many schools have a flow going into the AP classes that relates to the grades that you get in the course right before
Yep.
you would enter AP. Every school that I've worked, it's like, well, were you at this grade in your previous English class? If you were, you can be recommended for AP. If you weren't, there are these other kinds of classes. And let's talk about that. Is that a huge mistake? Should it fundamentally be about the passion of the student, the subjects that they're really interested in, the fact that if they have challenge, their grades will probably rise?
That's a great question. We ask teachers the same thing when we do our surveys, and tens of thousands of teachers at this point we've asked, and they think motivation and passion for the subject is more important than
Yeah.
anything else.
Yeah.
And that's where teachers are. And when you ask them, to what's important, they put test scores and previous grades very low on the list compared to some of these other things. And to some extent, that's really empowering. Motivation and passion are things that we can help students to unlock.
Yeah.
The very name
Yeah.
of the podcast, right? You spark creativity in a student and unlock their passion, and that's what teachers are saying is most important for student success in these courses. And so, how do we? And to your question about should you use grades and should you have these prerequisites? I would say look at the results that you're getting. Yes, that's the results on the test are a part of that, but the results in terms of who's there. Are you getting kids like my best friend who's trying to navigate their path as a first time in their family going to college?
Yeah.
Are you getting kids with who are Black? Are you getting kids who are Latino at the same rates as others? And if you're not, take a look at the system that you're using and redesign it to be more inclusive. Because what we found time and again, when schools all around the country closed access gaps, they maintained or increased the quality in terms of the outcomes on things like the exams. And so it's a counterintuitive notion, but if you can really push in to full participation and representation in those classes, you unlock students' motivation and things in exciting ways, and you get unexpected results.
It's very, very inspiring. And I'm sure that folks listening who are in the main creative English teachers are just thinking about what they can do and what steps they can take. I think they're in position to create challenging and creative courses. They're in position to speak with students about their opportunities. They're in position to raise their voices in department meetings and faculty meetings. What kind of steps would you think they should start with to help close this opportunity gap?
That's a great question. I would start talking to kids in your non-AP or non-IB classes and ask some of the questions that I started asking kids about. Are they being challenged? What are they looking for? Are they wanting to go to college? And get some information. And I think you can find some exciting passion. But what the kids are looking for, I think, from you, in my experience, particularly these what we called missing students, are looking for from you as a teacher is, do you believe that they can do it? Because
Mm.
they're in this formative phase around their adolescence and identity. And if they catch a whiff, there's a lot of adults to this day around the country in our meetings with superintendents and otherwise who say, I remember this one conversation I had with a counselor. I remember this one conversation I had with a teacher, and they told me I couldn't.
Mm.
Right. And they sort of had this moment
Yeah.
where it shut them down. And so any of those conversations you have, I would come from the point of this, opportunity gap where, do I want this kid to have an opportunity to do this type of work? And if so, how can I convey that to them and that I believe that they could be successful with it? And then I think, it's about recruiting kids. It's about having the dialogue. And then whether it's in department meetings or otherwise, I think you look for changes to policies that will open things up for more kids. And it's challenging in the classroom and it's scary. And I'm experiencing some of that now as I re-enter the classroom. I want my kids to be successful, and I'm setting a high bar. But could they be successful? Do they have the preparation they need ahead of time and things like that? Can mean a much more challenging class to teach, and so you get sort of worried about all of those things. And I would just say, at its most fundamental level, learning is about the incorporation of difference and diversity into our minds. If you walk into a classroom, you're engaging a text, you're engaging a set of ideas that aren't already in your brain. And so when you can involve more kids and more perspectives, and this is where English teachers excel,
Yeah.
the perspectives of all these different writers and enhance and make our lives more beautiful and more understandable, and more complete. And so I think you can create that in a classroom by including kids of all backgrounds. And in many cases, English departments have led the charge in a lot of the schools I've worked with around the country, where they've started to say things like, we're going to develop a sequence from 9th through 12th so that every kid is going to access an AP language or lit class. Every kid is going to do an IB English class, because we believe in the power of our subject matter to change lives, and we want to make it open to everybody and build a pathway for everybody to do that, whether they go to college or they go straight into a career or they go into credentials. To have the ability to take perspective and to write and process our ideas through writing is so powerful that let's figure out how we can include everybody in the best of what that subject has to offer, has been a really powerful and transformative thing that I've seen English teachers do once they build beyond their own class, to say, "Well, let's build policies as a school around this."
Wow, I love that. I feel so proud to be an English teacher.
Yes, yes.
Well, as students come into these AP and IB classes, maybe for the first time, and after maybe not having been given those opportunities before, what can teachers do to help them in those transitional months like September, October? We want students to feel comfortable. We want them to feel wanted in these new spaces. Um, what do you suggest?
Yeah, that's a great question. I spent a lot of time with English departments and across departments, and I know it's a passion of yours. These one pagers, on developing one pagers, right? And
Yes.
so, what does it mean to write an English essay? And what are the if I, as a teacher, am going to consolidate those insights into a page for a student to access? How do I do that? So we created our general essay guidelines. What does it mean to study a text? Does it mean I'm dwelling on every single word if I'm given a 50-page reading assignment? How do I read? Some of these things that even I, getting into college as a student, I don't feel like I ever had good instruction on how to read academic texts. And so I was there struggling over every word of every text for a while until a professor said, hey, there's other ways to read these things and get an understanding of it that's good for a college level seminar discussion. And when we're assigning you hundreds of pages a week, we expect you to use those techniques. So I think it's a little bit about making the inside scoop, or the insider's tactics, apparent. And I think one
Mm.
pagers are a really great way to do that. I think, I don't have as much research on this one, but it's just a personal tactic that I like is from the first day on, I'm making sure that every student is contributing to the conversation in the lesson.
Mhm.
And in the first couple of days, it can be difficult to say, "Oh, I don't, have anything to say," or this sort of thing. And I say, "Well, we can come back to you.
Yeah,
Is that okay?" And then they say, "Okay." And then you make sure you're actually coming back to them. And so you're setting a precedent from the beginning of the year that, hey, I believe in everybody's voice in this room. Everybody has valid things to say, and going in from that perspective. So, and then I think there's all sorts. Every teacher has their own policies and approaches, but I like to make sure that if kids didn't get it right out of the gate in terms of how they're preparing and doing their reading at home or how they're writing their essays or things like that, if they're building towards doing those things well by the end of the year, I credit that in terms of the points a lot more than did they have all the tactics that I wanted them to have for doing their schoolwork at the beginning of the year,
that makes
and
so
making
much
that clear to
sense.
them. Yeah.
Yeah, excellent. So, Reid, just to wrap up, we know that 90% of students across the United States hope to go to college. We know that 90% of parents hope that their students will go to college. If a high school was going to look at all the research that you've shared, was going to work with your nonprofit to honor these college dreams and make sure there's not this division between sort of one side of the school that has access and one side of the school that has low expectations, what are the sort of fundamental steps? 1, 2, 3, you need to get started like this.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the nonprofit that I started helps people with this. If people are interested, they have a new CEO and everything. I've been out of it for about 4 years, I think now, but it's called Equal Opportunity Schools, and they do great work on the step by step. And if you're, if and they bring best practices from other schools and things like that. But fundamentally, I think it's taking a look at the opportunity gap. How many kids of different backgrounds are potentially being overlooked when you
Yeah.
look at the demographics of your school and the demographics of your advanced classes. So that's where I always start and like to talk about, hey, an average school that we worked with had 100 missing students, who could be successful readily in more advanced classes if you close those access gaps there. So I start there and try to tell people to think about setting a goal of closing those gaps in as little as a year. Because if you do a little bit of work around those gaps, I think you often you fail to make the breakthrough and you fail to get the spark that you need, because one or two students coming in often feel isolated, like maybe they don't belong. Stereotype threat can lead to lower levels of performance, and then suddenly you somehow validated this notion that they were never ready to begin with,
Mm.
versus closing those gaps in a big way. So I look at the number of missing students, the size of those gaps, and try to set about closing them in the near term. And then that happens with conversations with kids. You can use that, you use data, or just casual conversation after class, with a kid who's in your class about what they're going to take next year, and really think about that recruiting and outreach, to close those gaps. And then some of the things we talked about in the classroom, making sure that every kid knows that you believe in them, as we all work to do, and that they have the resources to understand what each assignment is and how to get it done, whether or not, like you and me, they had parents who were educators, and could guide them in all of those things. And then I think once you get to that point, the level of breakthrough is so significant that it can change how you see things forever. And even in myself, I didn't know, even after I was enrolling kids and an advocate for this stuff or working with different schools, I pushed with them to say, let's really close this gap all the way. And you say, oh, is it really going to work out for these kids? Is it going to work out
Yeah.
for these teachers? Is it going to be okay? And it turns out great. And then you have changed your notion about what's possible for kids who've been underserved in the system. And then people get addicted to it and they say, wow, how can we make our after school programs equitable? How can we make our marching band equitable? How can
Yeah.
we include everybody in everything? Because
Yes.
education is amazing and we want everybody to have that chance to spark their creativity with great opportunities.
It's so inspiring. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing all of this, Reid. I know you've got your new book out, The Kid Across the Hall. Where can teachers go to get the book and also just generally to follow along with your work?
Sure. Yeah. The Kid Across the Hall is available through Stanford University Press and most major booksellers like Barnes and Noble and Amazon and things like that. If you like it, feel free to post a review of it. And then my other major project these days is I've just, so passionate about opportunity and making sure that every kid gets those great opportunities. I've been working on both mental health support for kids and did a paper on that. And recently threw my hat in the ring for state superintendent here in Washington State. So we're drilling into lots of evidence and working to change the opportunity for over 1 million kids here. And the website for that is Reid, REID, the number 4, WA schools.com, readforwaschools.com. So I really appreciate
Fantastic.
the opportunity to talk with everybody and to connect with you on this. It's an inspiring show that you have, and I love the work that English teachers are doing to change lives every day.
Thanks so much for joining us today for this important conversation. To learn more about Reid and his work, just follow the links in the show notes. Until next time, take care of yourself and stay creative.